This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 352 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Did I get you? Thanks for tuning in. I want to kick off this week's mailbag with some thoughts on probably the most polarizing prospect for fantasy purposes in this year's draft class, and that's Henry Ruggs. On the wide receiver prospecting episode that I did last week, I mentioned that Ruggs struggled in my model. And that's true. My model looks at college production, and Ruggs' college production was lacking a lot. The common comeback from someone who likes Ruggs is something like, well, yeah, you can't expect him to have great production if he's playing with all these really good teammates. And it's a fair thing to say. It's just that from what I've tested, it's really hard to find signal that good teammates drastically do something like this to a player's production profile. But I don't think that this means a player's teammates are irrelevant. I think it's just really hard to judge when we're entering a draft. Think of it this way. Each year, we can probably make this excuse to some degree with a handful of players. Sometimes it's valid, sometimes it's not. But the only way to be super sure that it's valid logic is if we look back years later and we say, you know what? Henry Ruggs actually didn't have strong college teammates because Jerry Jeudy and the rest of the Alabama skill players are actually trash. If that's the case, then chances are Ruggs just isn't very good because he couldn't beat out his trash teammates at Alabama. But maybe we look back 3 years from now and every single Alabama skill position player is just wrecking in the NFL. If that's the case, then it would make sense that Ruggs didn't have a good production profile whatsoever. So what I'm saying here is it's likely going to be very difficult for a model or even someone who scouts in a more traditional way to accurately know the impact that teammates are having on a player. This is why it's just hard for me to use that as an excuse for Ruggs' lack of production. Now let's assume that Ruggs goes in the first round of the draft. The wideouts who have had a negative stat score in my model, which is what Ruggs has, the players with a negative stat score in my model since 2006 who also went in the first round of the draft, every single one of them were fantasy football busts. There were 10 of them. But to be clear, like I just said, they were fantasy football busts. Remember, I'm modeling for fantasy football. A scout isn't. A scout in a team is looking what works for a particular team. When I input draft capital once the draft is over, Ruggs is still going to look fine in my model because that capital matters. I'll likely not have him as the third best wide receiver in rookie drafts this year. I'll probably have him outside the top 5. But you guys know by now that I don't look at fantasy football and player analysis in a very black and white way. Henry Ruggs can still be valuable in some way, even if I think that he's not as valuable as others do. The way I view him is that he's going to end up being a much better real football asset than a fantasy football one. Deshaun Jackson is someone who maybe never dominated fantasy football. But you look at how he impacted his offenses throughout his career, and it's evident that Deshaun Jackson was one of the most valuable wide receivers of the last decade. His quarterbacks consistently saw rises in yards per attempt when they had him. That's the kind of impact that Henry Ruggs could probably have. But when modeling for fantasy football, and when playing probability of translating college production to fantasy production at the NFL level, things don't look great for Ruggs. Always keep in mind that at times we're going to like players more in real football than in fantasy football. And the reverse of that is true too. And that's the case, I think, with Henry Ruggs. Now, before getting into the questions this week, I just wanted to send another reminder to check out the XFL contest over on FanDuel. I wrote up my XFL primer for the 2 slates here in week 4, and you can check that out over on numberfire.com. But head to FanDuel, click XFL in the lobby, and find the right contest for you. And feel free to use my primer to help. This first question is from @TJSumter55. Dynasty question. With the news of Sammy Watkins not returning to Kansas City, would you pull the trigger on a deal like Hardman for Kirk? So the news is more that the Chiefs likely aren't going to pay Sammy Watkins his scheduled salary. And that's not a surprise given how impactful he was throughout 2019. So he could still be there, he just wouldn't be as expensive if he is there. But Hardman for Kirk straight up, even if we assume Watkins is gone, I would rather have the Kirk side. By far. And the market is saying the exact same thing by a pretty wide margin. He's the wide receiver 30 in startups, whereas Mecole Hardman is the wide receiver 45. and that includes rookies, and this is according to DynastyLeagueFootball.com. I don't think Hardman's a bad buy, though. I actually almost talked about him last month when I was talking about my buy candidates for the offseason. But Kirk was a better prospect, he had a better rookie season compared to Hardman in a much worse environment overall, and even though Hardman's got the quarterback edge, he's still playing behind Travis Kelce and Tyreek Hill for the foreseeable future, in terms of target share. And it wouldn't be shocking to see both of those teams, the Cardinals and the Chiefs, go for a wideout in this year's class. And at least with Arizona, we know that Kirk's going to be on the field a whole lot, given the way that Cliff Kingsbury offense uses its wide receivers. So even though I like Hardman, I think Kirk is the easy answer here. This next question is from @bballclub. What do you project for Josh Jacobs in year 2 in the way of getting more reps as a pass catcher out of the backfield? Yeah, one of the weirder things that happened in 2019 is Josh Jacobs being more of an early down back for Oakland than a pass catching one. He had 242 rushes to just 27 targets. But his college production profile and his skill set showed a dude who was a pretty strong pass catcher. Despite being in a split backfield in college, he still had a 6.6% reception share during his final collegiate season. Anytime a running back is going to be on the field a lot, and anytime a team clearly likes a particular running back, and clearly the Raiders like Josh Jacobs given the draft equity they spent on him. But anytime you have that combination, that player is likely only going to see the ball more. Reports are already coming out saying that Josh Jacobs is going to be used more as a receiver. And last year, Oakland targeted their running backs at the 8th highest rate in the league. If they get Jacobs more involved, he could easily get to the 60 target range when you break everything down. So I'm cool with Josh Jacobs next season. We obviously just have to see what happens at the quarterback position for them. This next question is an email, which you guys can email me questions at jj@numberfire.com. But it's an email that says, "Hi JJ, love the podcast. Thanks." And that's all it says. No, just kidding. It says, "What do you think about dynasty trade value charts? I like to consult different ones to see if they agree or disagree on the value of a trade offer that I'm sending, but I sometimes think that they tend to be a bit behind the market, so undervaluing players whose value is increasing and overvaluing players whose value is decreasing. For example, I would be happy to get trade value that most charts say Sony Michel has, but the best deal I've completed to trade him away was a late second. David." I tend to look at average draft position a little bit more, only because you're getting inputs from multiple fantasy managers instead of a formula that someone might have created. But it also depends on how that chart's being generated. You can generate them in a lot of different ways. If it's just one person, then you're likely going to see different results than what the market value would dictate. But I'm a fan of looking at that kind of thing as well as trade calculators, because you can at least check your own brain to make sure that you're not doing anything radically stupid. It's also just good to know where the market is on players in Dynasty, because that's really what you're fighting against when you're trying to extract value. This next question says, "Hey boss, I was wondering something about your running back projection model. I know you always talk about the yards to touchdown ratio, and that's how you estimate the amount of touchdowns a running back should have or should have had. Example being that Aaron Jones and Derrick Henry will probably regress in touchdowns based on the absurd number that they got last year. Does your model include something with red zone touches? For instance, the amount of red zone touches the running back got versus the amount of plays run in the red zone. I feel like that would be a better predictor than yards, or at least if that heavily influenced the model, it might be more accurate. From the games I watched, their teams, Jones and Henry, loved using them in the red zone and forced it into their hands as much as possible when they were really close because they were so proficient. Seems to me that red zone usage percentage should far outweigh yards per game when predicting touchdowns. Thoughts? Sorry it's so long." Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. I feel like I'm not doing the best job in the world talking about the yards to touchdowns conversion that I talk about on this show because I get questions on it all the time. So my bad there, for real. But yes, red zone carries and carries close to the goal line matter. So do raw attempts. They all correlate to rushing touchdowns in the same year at about the same rate. It's really, really close. So you may be asking, then JJ, why do you talk about yards to touchdowns as opposed to red zone attempts to touchdowns or goal line rushes to touchdowns? And the answer is that yards are easier to predict than goal line touches are. So if the correlation between touchdowns and all these different statistics is relatively the same, when I'm projecting a season-long stat line for a player out, I'm going to want to use the stat that I'll be most successful at projecting. Now, during the NFL season, like when I'm talking 15 transactions, I'm looking at everything. I'm not basing decisions solely off of yards to touchdowns. And as I've said a lot in the past, I like using that metric because it's really easy for people to comprehend and do themselves. I'm trying to teach people how to be better fantasy players here. I'm not just giving you guys the answers. That's not fun. That's not engaging. But I also always reference things like Mike Clay's opportunity adjusted touchdown metric, which weighs these factors. It looks at where a player is getting his opportunities, not just the number of touchdowns that player has versus how many yards he has. So please, I hope I'm being totally clear here and you guys don't think that I'm a fraud. I'm not blindly using yards to touchdowns. That would be idiotic. Of course, a player in a good offense who's also seeing goal line work is going to outperform in yards to touchdowns. But it's a starting point for a lot of people to investigate further. And projecting yards is going to be a lot easier of a task than projecting something like goal line rushes. Thanks for getting me fired up. This next question is from @Mr. Neely B. Which of last year's rookie wide receivers do you think will have the biggest 2020? Yeah, this is easily A.J. Brown. The only potential concern is the fact that Tennessee could continue to be pretty run heavy. But he was the most impressive and best rookie wide receiver in 2019. Now, I don't mind Terry McLaurin, but Brown has a lot of production metrics that look favorable for his future. For example, and this is a fun one from my buddy Evan Silva, who you guys know from Establish the Run, but he tweeted back in January that the top 10 rookie wideouts in yards per route run over the last 10 years were Martavis Bryant, who obviously had off-the-field stuff, OBJ, A.J. Brown, Percy Harvin, Tyreek Hill, Hakeem Nicks, Doug Baldwin, Juju Smith-Schuster, A.J. Green, and Julio Jones. That's pretty good company. And then if you go and you query rookie wide receivers with at least 70 targets, in NFL history, or at least since they started tracking targets, A.J. Brown is first in yards per target as a rookie. Efficiency metrics don't always seamlessly translate year to year, but A.J. Brown is probably special. This next question says, "Hey JJ, big fan of the podcast. Thanks. You helped lead me to a first and second place finish in my 2 leagues this year, so thank you. You're very welcome. My question is about a potential late round quarterback target, Tyrod Taylor. Why hasn't there been more buzz around him after the departure of Rivers? I remember riding Ty God in 2015 through 2017, kind of like a current Josh Allen light. Every indication I've seen suggests that he'll be the starter for the Chargers this year. He provides a decent floor with his legs, and the Chargers offer more weapons than he ever had in Buffalo. Am I crazy for being the only one high on him for late draft value? Thanks for all your great insight, Anthony from Boston." Yeah, I mean, I don't think that you're hearing about him that much for a couple of reasons. The first one being that quarterback is so deep, and it generally doesn't matter in fantasy football. So talking about a guy who you'd likely add off the waiver wire is just kind of not worth it this time of year. Things can change though too. The Chargers could go after a quarterback in the draft and make people less confident about Tyrod Taylor. But I think the main reason that there's not a lot of buzz is because there just doesn't need to be a lot of buzz. Unless you're playing in Superflex, but that's not the majority. But yeah, I do think that he's going to be a very, very interesting late round quarterback / waiver wire ad entering next year. This last question is from @FFBMN. How are you feeling about Devontae Freeman next year and Dynasty? There's a lot of speculation about him getting cut and whatnot. I'm higher than most, but curious what your thoughts are. I mean, it's really hard for me to get excited about almost any veteran running back who's getting cut, let alone one who's going to be 28 years old, who's had a history of injuries. And then on top of that, you've got a really good running back draft class this year. It wouldn't make a whole lot of sense for a team that's looking for a running back starter to do that via free agency versus the draft. Which means Freeman would likely be going into a committee. Maybe we see him in like Pittsburgh or something. But it's hard to get excited about a profile like that, especially with this particular draft upcoming. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening, as always. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Always appreciate you listening. Enjoy your weekend.